All right. So, welcome to Tech Collective's Web Dev Workshop. I'm Brandon Bernier. Mark Fenton will kind of be doing the second half of this. Um, so, what we want to start with is kind of a very broad and general overview of things you may want to work with, or things you're going to need to work with for any web project you're doing. So, the basics of HTML and CSS. And I'll start with a disclaimer that neither of us are kind of experts on any of this. We literally learned this by Googling stuff and figuring it out as we go. So I'm going to try to show you how to do that as well. So not just give you kind of basic things to work off of, but also how to figure it out when you don't know what you're doing, like us. So, how many people have never coded anything before? Okay, awesome. How many people are somewhat familiar with HTML and CSS? Okay, that's good. So the first thing I'm going to start with is HTML. So if you want to follow along, what I'm going to be working out of is this site jsbin.com. So what this will do is you can write HTML, and in live you'll see the output pop up here. You could also do CSS and JavaScript on here. Um, so if I type something like hello, it'll automatically come up in my output. So you can see exactly what you're doing and how it's corresponding on what you'd see in a website. So just to start with a real brief overview of HTML. HTML is basically what you'll set up the actual content of your website in. So everything that you want to see, all the text, images, you're going to set that up in HTML. Later on with CSS, you can actually kind of modify how the page looks. And then if you want to actually do anything interactive, um, Mark will talk about how to do that on the back end. So this is all going to be front end stuff, what it's going to look like. So HTML works with what they call HTML tags. So each one of these is a separate tag. Um, and this is the basic structure of what any website is going to look like. So you have kind of an opening tag and a closing tag. So you can see it top and bottom, HTML, and then it closes the HTML. So everything within that you're specifying is your HTML code. The head, so you can see the head here, everything within that is basically the title of the page, any metadata that you need to pass on to whatever is actually viewing it. So things like the viewport and the device width is going to be how it figures out whether you're on like a laptop, a desktop, the size of your screen, and how to adjust based on that. So title, we can change our title here. This is basically what would just appear up at the top in your browser. So you can see that change real quick. So there's a lot you can add in here. Things like uh, social media tags. So when you take a link from a website, plop it into Facebook, you know how it gives you like a preview of an image or some text describing it. You can add that all in here. Things like keywords to pick up in search engines. That's all stuff you want to add in the head. The body is where all the actual content of your website would go. So if we just start typing stuff in here, you can see it comes up, but it's kind of just text that's sitting there. Obviously doesn't look very much like a website. So there are other tags we want to use to define what the different elements on our page are. So I'll just go through some of the basic tags that you use. So things like um, headers, so titles on your page. Generally, there are like 6 headers. Um, Probably won't use all of them, but if we put something inside of those 2 tags, so header 1, the tag would just be H1. We can put a title in there, and there's automatically some formatting going on based on that individual tag. Another one you want to use a lot are paragraph tags. Setting up a different paragraph underneath that. A few other things to kind of have on here. You can add multiple tags. Say we want to have another paragraph now, and say we want this one to be italicized. So there's two different ways of doing this. You used to be able to just do an I for italicized. Now it's kind of more common and standard to use EM, so emphasis. So you can add different tags to add emphasis. You can use strong, which is basically the same as bold. So there's a lot you can do with different tags to start just figuring out where your content's going to go and setting this all up. So say we want to do something a little more interesting and we add in an image. So there's an image tag, and then we need to also add in where the image is coming from. So say we pull an image off of our website. We can copy the URL, and we add this image in. Obviously, we haven't said anything about what size it should be, so right now it's just showing up huge. But we can add an image in. If we want to, say, make the image a clickable link, we can add another tag that's called an anchor. And tell it where to go. So if you've done some CSS before, this is all probably pretty straightforward and simple. So now you can see the image is a clickable link. If I click on it, it'll go straight over to that. Honestly, there's not a ton in CSS or in HTML that you need to do. So you set up all of your content in this way, different paragraphs, and you'll start to get the general idea of what the content on your website is going to start to look like. There are other things you can add in here. So instead of just having the head and body, you can add in different tags like a header. So if you want to have an image that's at the top of your website, a footer if you have something that's common to every page across your website would be another good thing to add on here. So let's start jumping over to CSS before we kind of do anything more to see what we can do to start to format some of the things over here. So in CSS, the way you refer to anything in the HTML is kind of with those same names. So in CSS, say we want to make every paragraph text color red. So we go ahead and we just say, all right, we have this HTML tag, that P, so we can put that in here. And then there are a ton of different things we can change with CSS. So kind of as you go and think about what you want to do, kind of start Googling along and saying, hey, there's actually a way to easily just do that. So if we just change the color, you can add in red, and you see every paragraph that I set up, the text is now red. So we didn't change anything with the header, so that, or the heading, so that changed, or that's black. The paragraphs changed to red. So what if we didn't want all of these paragraphs to go red, right? You may just want to set one individual paragraph red, others different colors. What you can start doing is specifying classes and IDs in your HTML. So a class is basically some attribute that you can apply onto one of these tags and then refer to it later. So if you go into one of these tags, we can add in a class and give it a name. So let's say we want this specific paragraph to have the red class. And instead of doing what we're doing up here now, we're going to refer to it the way you refer to classes in the CSS is with a dot or a period and then the class name. So you can see now just that first paragraph we had is red, the other one stayed black. So you can add multiple classes, define in the CSS different attributes that you want each class to have, and it's an easy way to start setting up kind of different standards for each type of element in your CS or in the HTML. So if anyone has questions or if you're confused about kind of what I'm doing, stop me. We're trying to make this very casual. Um, so if you're not following, feel free to stop me, or if it's too easy, tell me to move along. So what else can we do? We want to do something with this image. We want to tell it how big we want it to be. So let's go and look at this image. Right now we only have one, so I'm just going to refer to it by that tag name. So another attribute we can add in here is width. I'm just going to make it 100% right now. So what that does is it takes anything with this image tag and says, hey, I want the width of that to be 100% of whatever it's within. Basically, you have all of these different things within the body. So what the image is going to do is it's going to become 100% of the width of the body. Yeah. Well, basically, so the way CSS works, or I should have said this to start. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. So what happens is anything that happens below this will take precedent above whatever kind of you defined before. So you can have multiple CSS sheets. It's kind of redundant because it's style sheets. But if you define these sheets in your HTML, whatever comes last takes precedence. So you can say, all right, it's red in this one, blue in this one, green in this one. If it's green at the end, that's going to take precedence. So say I had all images are going to be 100% width. Let's just copy and paste this here for a second. I'll add in another image. What I'm going to do is now I can give that image, the second one that I want to change specifically, either a class name or an ID. So a class name you can apply to multiple items, whereas an ID you can only apply to a single item on a page. So in this case, let me just say class equals half. So I can refer now to that specific class and say for those items I want the width to be 50%. So now, although that's an image, its class is being defined afterwards. Um, I think it'll still change because what's happening there is the level of specificity is going to take precedence as well. So image is your general tag, and then since I have a specific class, um, that'll take precedence. What'll happen is if I then say, if I define this again, right? So in this case, if I kind of overwrite myself, you shouldn't do that within the same CSS file. But if you have multiple files, for instance, if you're working off of like a framework that has its own CSS and you want to overwrite that, whatever comes last, you can use to overwrite things before it. So this one's last, it's going to be 75%. If I move that up here, it'll go back to 50. Right. And you can specify these things kind of within here. So I can say I want any image which has class half, or I should be able to get rid of that. Right, so now, or what is it doing now? What do you say? Or does it have to be? Why is that not working? So say you had multiple classes. So say, let me think. What can I add here? So if you have, for instance, an image that you have a class that's going to specify its width, and say there's another class um, that applies to multiple items, um, you can basically set it so that it'll look at things that only have both of those classes. So you can specify um, it has to have both of these to become 50%. So you can see that the one that has just class half is now 100% because it doesn't have the red class. If I come down here and say also, why is that not working? I'm not sure what's happening with that. But you should be able to have it so that anything that both of those classes becomes 50% in that case. So other kind of interesting things you can do within CSS. So say I wanted to add a border to this image. I can say define a solid border that's 5 pixels and black. All right, so I can throw borders on here. I can set border radius, which just kind of curls the edges. So there's a lot that you kind of just pick up on. You'll never really know everything you can do with CSS, but the way you kind of figure these things out, if you Google and say, all right, I want rounded edges on images with CSS, first thing that pops up is going to, all right, here's how I do rounded corners. And this w3schools.com is probably the top resource to figure any of this stuff out. They have literally everything you can do with CSS in here. It'll explain how to use it, gives you tons of examples. So different things you can use, background color, width, height, lots of things you can set up with CSS very simply. So right now, let me go back here. Within CSS, you also have the ability to kind of specify which corners this applies to. So in anything you do, if you just put one value here for something like this, it'll apply that to all four corners, or if you're, say, like applying padding to the top, bottom, left, and right, it'll apply it to all four. If you add in a second number, in this case, what it'll do is that 20 pixels is going to apply to the top left corner and bottom right corner, and the 0 now is applying to the opposite two. And then you can also specify four numbers so that you are defining each corner individually. So they make it easy. If you want to just have a single value for all of those, you can do that. If you want to just do top, bottom, left, and right, you can do that. Or if you want to put on different numbers for all four of those, it's easy to do that as well. So the one other important thing to discuss as far as CSS is concerned is the CSS box model. I'm going to pull up kind of their picture of it. This is important to kind of understand how to position items and how to make them kind of go where you want them to. So for every item, you have the content itself. So say that image we were just working on. You then have padding that you can add around that to add space. The border comes around the padding, and then you can add margins to basically space it away from other items within that. So what I'm going to do is come back here, and I'll add in padding and margins so you can see how those individually affect this. So let's say I want to add in padding. If I just do padding, it'll add it to all four as well. I could specify here padding on top. So say I want 10 pixels of padding on top. You can see it added in space between the content and your border. All right, so say that's not what I wanted. Say I wanted to basically add space between this image and the text that was above it. That's when you would add in a margin. So I can add in margin on top and say I want 30 pixels of space. Oh. All right, so now it added space between the actual previous content and the outside of my border rather than more space within the border itself. Yeah. So if you wanted, you could do just margin. 30 pixels will give you 30 pixels of margin all the way around. If you want, say, 30 pixels on the top and bottom, but nothing on the left and right, you can do 30, so that's top, bottom, 0, left and right. Or you could do 30 on top, and then this will give you nothing on the right, bottom, and left side. I don't think so. I mean, again, I would go back, look at the info on border radius and kind of see how you can use it. All right, so yeah, you actually can. Right. So I mean, in everything, there's probably a way to do it in CSS. It's just a matter of Google what you think you want to do, see if there's a way. Yeah. Right. You can specify different behavior. How do you have the width of the image defined? That afterwards, see if we can figure out something specific for that. Um, so what else can I do here? Where was I? All right, so I did the margin, the padding, as far as the box model is concerned. So that's just important in being able to position the content where you want it, and knowing kind of how to get things to relate to each other. Um, so any other kind of basic questions about HTML and CSS? I don't want to spend a ton of time before we get into the mock-up website that we created. I think, is there anything else? You can, but it gets really disgusting. Um, you want to avoid that if possible. So yeah, so like within these tags, you can say, all right, style, and then say width is 100%, but you're just adding a lot into that piece of the code, and the whole point is, all right, rather than doing that for every image where you have to add it into the tag, CSS lets me just define it for all the images or for all the things with a specific class. So it separates your content itself and the structure of your site from um, the actual styling. So I'll talk a little bit about Bootstrap. Bootstrap makes it extremely easy to just kind of start a website from the ground up. So this is what a ton of actual websites are built on. So it's a framework that gives you basically a huge head start in getting anything onto your site that you want. Um, So if you go to getting started on here, the easiest way to include Bootstrap in your website or project is with these links here. So there's a CSS file that they give you. So there's Bootstrap min.css. You need to add all this into your site, and then there's some JavaScript that you need to add in to make sure that everything that they set up works properly. Um, when I was doing this before, it wasn't doing what it needed, but let me see. Let me add these. Over here. This will get a tiny bit messy just because of the way I'm doing this. All right, so once that stuff's added in, what you can do in Bootstrap is they give you a ton of components that you can just grab from and throw into your site. So one that I'm going to show you here is the nav bar. So they have this generic block of code that you can just drop in to give yourself a simple navigation bar. It'll look like this at the top, basically. And what Bootstrap is designed for is to give you basically mobile first design. So it makes it simple to have your website work nicely across a mobile device, on a laptop, on a desktop with a huge screen. So it makes it really work across all screen sizes. So you can see I just dropped that nav bar block into the body here. We can modify it to do what we want. Um, you can see once I stretch it out, we've got, yeah, so these weren't working before either. So the nav bar shows up here. The drop downs aren't working for me right now. That has to do with the JavaScript file that it's pulling in. For whatever reason, it wasn't working before. Um, I'm not sure. But you can see how at a full width screen, you have these nice drop downs. When I shrink it down, you get this nav bar that would work well on like your smartphone. If the JavaScript was working, this would pop out and show you your different options. And you can modify that however you want. So say you just wanted to have this stuff on the left and not these links on the right. If you kind of look through their code, they have a ton of different classes already defined that are setting this stuff up. So navbar default are going to set the navbar itself up. There's this section here gives you the back and forth between the little block on the top right to get your drop down of the navbar, or the stuff all the way across when it's full width. And really the way to kind of learn some of this stuff is to just look through their code, see what you can use, and copy it over into an application that's useful for you. So one type of tag that I didn't mention was UL. So this is an unordered list. There's also ordered lists. But the way a lot of, say, nav bars in this case work is you have this unordered list that you're going to say, this is my drop down menu, and then you have list items. So that's what this LI tag is. You have specific items within that unordered list. So under this drop down, I have a bunch of different links that I can go to. I just put it inside the body tag. Yeah, just at the top of that. Yeah. Where? There we go. No problem. So say we wanted to get rid of the stuff on the right. You can see here there's this navbar right class where that's getting defined. If we just go ahead and delete that, now we just have the stuff on the left that we wanted. So you can modify this as much as you want to make the navbar that you need for your site, but they have tons of other stuff that you can just drop in, things like Jumbotron that he was mentioning before. They have it all the code set up for you here, um, to just be able to drop these things in. What else? You can do panels. So if you have content that needs like a heading and then some content within it, you can do that. And this is the way we did our Tech Collective website. So I took some of this example um, code from the Bootstrap site, made our own nav bar, so added to it. Then within that, so something like here. So these are different panels that we set up. So drop the code in, modify it for what you need or for what you're trying to do, and kind of figure it out from there. So anything else with Bootstrap before we get into Dank Tank? Does anyone have any other questions before we kind of jump along? All right, so how do I actually show them what this tank looks like? So that's a little. So this is a site that we threw together yesterday. I did the front end, Mark did the back end. So what it is what we call Dank Tank. So Dank memes all day long. Um, what you can do is submit your own memes. You can rank them. So whether it's dank or dusty, we think it's really going to catch on. So I think right now we only have the one image in here. Um, but basically, the more images there are, you can just click through, kind of like Tinder for memes, whether you like them or not. And then we set it up so that you can see what the dankest meme is, the dustiest meme, and then we have some categories. We didn't go all the way with the categories. So right now, I was just using it as a way to show you how you can set up with these different panels, basically a thumbnail to jump into something more. Um, so the other important thing that I didn't mention about Bootstrap is what they do to be able to make everything scale. So let me pull this out of full screen. All right, so as I go wide, you can see the full width version. As it narrows down, I now have what it would look like on, say, a mobile phone, where you've got this drop down, and then everything goes into this one column format, right? So the way Bootstrap sets up the page you're working with is it divides it into 12 columns. So you can specify basically how many of those columns you want each thing to take up. So in our case, the first division there is basically our left contact and then the sidebar. So if we look at the code for the layout here, where's the actual block body? All right. So as you start getting a little bit more familiar with Bootstrap, the way everything gets set up is you have a row with columns. So another I mentioned is a div. So basically, it creates a division that you can specify content within on a page. So you can have one row, and then within that you define columns. So to define how wide you want the columns is any number from 1 to 12, right? So if I wanted one column, which was the whole width of the page, define it so that at different screen widths you have different values. 12 columns, so that it's going to be basically um, you can see kind of the different things that are in the sidebar, so that we can define different styles within that. Let me see. All right, so I know it looks kind of like a lot of code, but start looking through the following. All right, what do we have? Columns. Making it italicized. Buttons for Dusty and Dank set up. So each of those is taking out now breakdown of columns within this left side, right? So I had this was of that. Each of these is defined as columns within that side. So Bootstrap makes it really easy to just specify kind of how you want things to break down. If I wanted it to, I can specify at different screen sizes. So where it says column small 8, I can say for an extra large screen. So col extra large, I can make it less than that so that it's not going extremely wide. Um, it gives you a lot of ability to uh, work with things on a scale that makes it really easy to go between kind of what it looks like on mobile and on a full width device. Let me see if there's anything else right now worth talking about before I let Mark describe some of the back end stuff. But may actually help in your case with the Bootstrap stuff. They give you a lot of different classes that you can use, so that rather than going into the CSS and doing it yourself to say center an image or um, make something specific color, they give you classes. So say for images, you want it to be 100% width. You can just say, all right, this image is going to have class image responsive, which makes it responsive to whatever it's within. If I say center block, it's going to also center that image. So pick up on as you look through the Bootstrap site and see, all right, here's how they work with images. What kind of tags or what classes can I use to sync what I want? No, that's just on the actual formatting of the text. So the reason that they moved away from bold and italicized, um, I read up on this at one point. I think it had to do with um, like screen reader devices for accessibility. That they wanted to differentiate more so between just things being bold, but um, this is something that should actually be strong. I don't know how to describe it. I can look it up and see why they decided, but I know the standard used to be just kind of B for bold, I for italicized. Now that's kind of taboo to use. You want to use the strong and emphasis. Um, I mean, on some of this stuff, I didn't specifically show it, but Bootstrap has stuff for like screen readers built in. So where, let's see if I can find it. So like up here with that navigation bar. So when I'm in the mobile version, I just have like the box at the top to get to um, my full drop down. They have this already in here, so they have this class screen reader only. It adds in this text toggle navigation so that when the screen reader is going across, it won't read off this text. Otherwise, they don't know that it's up there to be able to use. So they have a lot of stuff kind of just built in that you wind up using and maybe don't even realize it at first. Um, and so that's kind of where I'll stop on how we got the basics of this. So you have everything on GitHub to see kind of the full code and how this is working. But I'll turn it over to Mark to discuss how he has kind of this whole setup with keeping track of what's dusty and dank. He's got a login system, so um, we don't really have that set up fully to like register as a user, but we have an admin login that without being logged in, you won't be able to submit your own dank memes. Uh, so yeah, so like right now I went to submit, but I'm not logged in. So I'll let Mark come up and log in and walk you through.
Okay, so the second part of this whole thing is sort of going to be focused on what's called the Flask framework. It's a framework for Python for sort of designing the back end part of websites. If you want to be able to run that, this is all done in Python 2.7. So if you download Python 2.7 and install it, and then if you go to the GitHub page, the README has which modules you need to install using pip, which is sort of the package manager for Python. If you don't know that, it pulls all the code in for you so that you can run the code we have. Uh, I don't know. Flask is just sort of very, I don't want to say simple, but it's a little more lightweight than say like a framework like Django, which is designed for like a lot of content delivery. Flask, you can literally deliver a page as small as like "Hello World" with like 10 lines of code. So I guess I'll give an example of sort of what the basic functionality of the site is. So if we log in, sort of the code I have set up isn't really good production code. You'll notice there's sort of a config at the beginning that sets a default password, and that's all committed to GitHub. So if you're planning on making an actual website, don't commit your passwords to GitHub. It's kind of a bad idea. But the default password we have is just admin for login, password for password. If you log in, you go back to submit. You pick a title. Call it plain, and I'll put this one here. So we have a title field. We have sort of a file upload that you can do. We forgot to change the CSS on that because we built this last night. But you hit upload. It brings you back to the main page. If we click through this a few times, we should eventually get the other one because it's just sort of pulling one randomly. Hopefully. If I didn't break something. There we go. So sort of the way this all works is for CSS and HTML, it's awesome if you're making sort of static web pages where the content isn't changing. You can also make it a little more dynamic with JavaScript, make it a little more, I don't know, sort of flashy with things moving around, reacting to people clicking on them. But in the end, if you want to have content that's sort of user provided or provided by someone who sort of manages, say, if you have like a blog or something who's submitting posts, you need to have some sort of way to drop that dynamic content into your static content. And that's what this Flask framework makes it very easy to do. So if we move over to that, we'll see in the source code we have this one file called danksite.py. This provides all the functionality for the website on the back end. And then there's a few other folders that we have here as well. So danksite.py is the actual Python that runs this website. We have a static folder, which contains any sort of content on the website that's static. In the case of this, it holds our JavaScript files, our CSS files, because none of that's changing on our side. It holds the uploaded images from users. The second major folder here is one called templates. So these static and templates folder are sort of part of the Flask framework. It's just sort of the way you organize things in your project. Templates is a folder full of HTML files. So the way Flask works is it takes these templates, it looks at them, and based on the code you have in the templates, it's able to sort of insert things on the fly while it's serving the web page. So if we look here, we have the main one called layout. This is sort of the main file that gets served every time we serve a web page. This has our header, our footer, and sort of all the style sheets and JavaScript that get pulled in from content delivery networks that we need. Eventually, if you scroll down it, we sort of get down towards the body tag, and then we have this stuff here. So this is where we sort of transition over from sort of classic HTML and CSS and start looking at sort of dynamic content. Flask uses a templating language known as GWTC. Django has its own templating language. Basically, what these templating languages let you do is insert more code into your HTML files so that you can dynamically add something into the HTML file. So here I have this block body, end block. What that is it's sort of a tag that lets you do a server-side include of more HTML. So because we want the header and footer in every page, we have that, and then we have this body block that we can sort of drop in depending on which page we're serving. So sort of as an example of that, if we go to the categories page, we see at the top, see anything with these curly braces, that's that Jinja2 markup language. So we can see we're extending layout.html because we want everything to have that layout content. And then we're defining the beginning of the block body, and then at the bottom we have the end block to denote this code gets dropped in between those two tags in that HTML file we're extending. So that's sort of the way this templating language works and the way we sort of interact with loading web pages through Flask. Sort of another thing to note with that is for all these URLs, instead of sort of typing a static URL, we can define a URL that refers to a certain function in our Flask code. So say here where we want to pull the dankest post, we have this here. So we have the double curly braces saying we're inserting some code in here. URL 4 is a function that Flask provides that lets you pull the URL for a certain function in your Flask code. So if we go back to the Flask code, we see we're pulling URL 4 show post. If we go down here, we have this definition for a function here called show post. So it'll automatically pull the URL, which is this here. And I'll get more into how we sort of define these functions in a second once I sort of get through the whole layout stuff. So we can sort of dynamically drop that URL in there. We have a little argument added here to the URL, which sort of tells the server we're pulling the dankest or the dustiest. You don't need the argument, but it's something that makes it easier if you're sort of pulling certain data. You can see here, like all sort of the logo pictures and stuff is all pulled from that static directory. We have one for pictures, one for uploads. Pull that down over here. So we have pictures, CSS, JavaScript, uploads. So that sort of is the HTML side of this. Going over to the actual code part, I don't know, how familiar are you with Python in this room? Who's used it before? Who hasn't used it? I don't know. Okay, got a couple. So Python's a scripting language. It's pretty awesome because you can do stuff with very few lines of code. Depending on what modules you load and stuff, it starts to look like you're writing in English because like you write one line and it does like what 1,000 lines of C would do. But basically every file sort of has this beginning section, which we call sort of the imports. So we import OS, which gives us some functions that the OS has, like looking for files, checking if they exist, saving files. We then import Flask. So we say from Flask, import Flask request session. These are all sort of different functions from the Flask framework that we use in our website. There's a few other things we pull. The other big one we pull is this thing called SQL Alchemy. I'm very lazy, so I don't like custom writing sort of all my SQL queries. SQL Alchemy is, I forget what the exact phrase for it is, but it's sort of like a wrapper for SQL. In this case, we're using it with SQLite, which is sort of a implementation of SQL that you can run locally. It's kind of awesome. It's what all Android phones use to save their data. But that's basically how we're saving our user content and keeping track of it. Is we need a database to keep track of those things. You could do it. In this case, we're not really doing anything complicated, like saying we want to enter it eventually, but this is just sort of a really lame database where there's a single table storing each post. But eventually you can sort of link tables because for the database you want to show the relationships between things. That's something we can add on to, but it's a little more complicated, so I wanted to save it for maybe a later workshop. But that's sort of that for the includes. I'll sort of skip over the config for now and sort of get more into what does a Flask app look like. So these 4 lines right here basically what sort of initialize the app. We're saying we want a flat app call that's a Flask object or of the class Flask. We're configuring it with these options I had up here. I'll maybe get into some of those later on. We're configuring it with SQL Alchemy using an SQLite database. We tell it where that database is supposed to be saved, and then we sort of initialize our database DB as this SQL Alchemy object. So once you have sort of that initialized, the way we sort of go about defining pages in Flask is by defining a function with what's called a decorator. So here we see we have this @app.root and then just a slash that's saying we want to look at the root directory of our website. So basically, if you're working in HTML, usually you have your index.html. This is just sort of what you would get if you type in your website's name. It's the first page it pulls up. So use app.root, and then whatever you put in quotes is sort of what you want the URL or the little bit added on to the end of your main URL to be for that function. You define the function, so you say def to define the function name, and then you can do whatever you want to do in Python. You can pull content from a database, you can increment some value or something, you can work in some sort of API, some RESTful API. But the basic structure is that decorator, the function name, and then at the end, you need to return something. When you're returning something, you're sending something to the browser saying, you should load this. You're basically sending data to the user. So in this case, we're returning, and then we call this function called render template. What this does is it looks at our templates file. We tell it which one we want. We want it to show post, so we use the showpost.html file, and it pulls together whatever we had included into each of the files. It takes each of those bits of code lines and inserts the URLs dynamically, and then it sends that to the user. Another thing we can sort of do with that is you'll see there's two arguments to this render templates function. So we have the file that we want to load, but then we also want to tell it what we want to dynamically load into that file. So we have this entries equals post. So what I did up here, I'll get into a little bit later, but we define a post that's just something that's pulled from the database. It's basically the image and the title for the image. So if we go back to that show post file, and we look here, we see again that template tag with curly braces. So we see for entry in entries. So when we called that render template, it looked at this file and said, oh, we have this for entry in entries. Well, I sent it what entries was. So for each entry in that entries objects I pass it, it's going to increment through them and basically generate this block of HTML. So if I sent it like 20 posts, we could render 20 images. That's not how we have the site set up currently, but you can do it. I mean, we did it while we were testing the site. You could post like a column of 20 memes or whatever you want to do. But basically, this is the way like a blog or something would work. If you had like a bunch of posts and you clicked and you wanted like a category, you would do a database query for all things in that category. You would pass it as entries, and then this code would automatically drop all that, so you're not like statically writing in each blog post. This is just dropping them all in for you based on this structure, and then it'll be stylable to CSS. So you can see we have for entry and entries, so for each entry, we can sort of drop in the file name because our database saves the file name for each uploaded file. And then you can see we're pulling that from the source uploads folder. So we're taking static/uploads, and then we're appending the file name so that it automatically pulls in the file name for the file for that post. You'll see we also use the ID from that entry, sort of I'll talk about it a little bit more when I go back to the databases, but each entry has a unique ID that identifies it. And what this lets us do is generate buttons on the website that can uniquely refer to some post in the database. So this is what lets us actually upvote and downvote each post, so we know when the user clicks what post we're actually referring to back on the server side. Sort of an extra line we added here. If no entries are sent, it thinks there's no entries, so it says no entries, how dusty, instead of actually trying to display a post. So are there any questions so far about that, or how to figure all this out? So If you look into Flask at all, there's a very basic intro tutorial on their website. If you look into SQLite, they also have a very basic sort of layout for a website. You'll notice that this code is very much sort of a hack together Frankenstein of both those tutorials. So that we use both the intro to Flask and the intro to SQLite, and it's just sort of jammed together. I don't know. It helps a lot when you're doing this to sort of have a. It helps to learn Python first. I'll say you get used to sort of how you deal with data and objects in Python, and then once you learn that, it's very easy to go and start working with this stuff because the whole framework's in Python, so everything's very Pythonic. It's not really a jump to go from knowing Python to knowing Flask. Yeah. Okay, so this is where it gets tricky. So when you're doing HTML, CSS, you can just load that page in the browser, no big deal. Problem is when you start adding server-side content, you need a server. So Flask is very nice in that it has its own server contained in it. So when you call the function, it'll start up a server that serves that web page. This isn't something you want to do on a production server. We're planning on doing another workshop to show you how to set up not a very secure production server, but a production server you can start messing around on to sort of drop this web page onto. So, I'll sort of show it here. You can see all this sort of garbled mess of events. You can see on the left we have 127.0.0.1. For those of you who don't know, that's the localhost IP address. It's basically a loopback address to your own machine. So I'm looking at my own computer and it's serving the web page to itself. These get and posts. Get is the browser requesting the web page. Post is the browser sending data back to the server. If I stop this real quick. So basically, if you have Python installed, you have all your modules installed, you can call, I don't know if you can see that. Yeah, you can see that. You're basically just calling Python and then the file name, the Python file that we're running. If you hit enter, it'll start up the server. You'll see that I don't have my prompt back because it's actively running the server. There's some nice features with this. So if you look at my config, I have it set up up here. Or at least I thought I did. Yeah. So I have this debug equals true in the config. It's very nice in that the Flask server will automatically update your web page and what it serves, even if you're changing the backend code, as long as there's no syntax errors. If there's a syntax error, it'll stop the server. Let's say I want to, I don't want to play with the backend part of it, but if you change your layout files, if you change your Python code, the server in debug mode will do its best to automatically update the server and serve those pages. And if something goes wrong, the browser will give you a whole bunch of debug data when it fails. That's why it's not a good idea to use it for production means, because you're going to spit out a ton of debug data at your users, and users generally don't like that. But it's really nice when you're sort of developing the website to get something up and running. What was I going to do next? So that was sort of how you design a certain page that you can call through Flask. You'll notice I have several of these defined. So we have app.route, and that's the root directory. We have one that's called add. You'll notice this add one has this methods where it can serve both a get and a post request. That's because when we add an item, if they're sending a get request, we want to send them the form to submit the item, but we also want to allow them to post the item from that same web page. We have another one for the login, another one for logout. We have, this one's a little different because this one doesn't actually serve a web page, this app.root/vote. This doesn't serve a web page, but it's a URL that the browser can access to post data. So in this case, this is what the browser actually sends the upvote and downvote to, so that the server knows to update the value for the dank rank, as we call it, for each image. And then sort of the most basic one we have here is this categories one, where we're literally just rendering the categories template and sending it out because we don't have any dynamic stuff set up for that part of the website yet. So I guess what I'll cover next is sort of the database part of this, which we have a very basic database, but sometimes that's all you really need to get started out. It's just sort of a place to dump data. So this class right here, so we're sort of defining an object or sort of a structure to save our data in. We called it dank post just because it's sort of descriptive. It's to save each post on the website. It inherits this database.model, which is part of the SQLalchemy sort of setup for databases. And what that allows us to do is we can use these different things. So we have these column and integer and string fields. You'll see that those are all imported up here from SQLalchemy. So these are very specific data types that refer to data types in a database entry. These are data types that are specific to a database. So the way a database is set up is you have like a table. So we have you'll see the class, and then the next thing is indented underneath it, so all that stuff's under class for this. So this def init is indented into class. So this is saying whenever you make one of these dank posts, do this stuff, and we send it itself, a title, and a file name. So see, it says self.title, we set that equal to the title that's passed, self.file name, that's equal to the file name that's passed, self.dank rank, we initialize to 0. And then the timestamp, we use Python's datetime library to get UTC now. And as we get UTC time, because otherwise all your timestamps will be the current time for the wherever the server happens to be on the face of the earth. So that's sort of how we define our table for the database. And then you'll notice indented back out sort of in the main line of code here, we have db.createAll. So what this is going to do is it's going to look at your objects that are in your database, those db.models, and it's going to build a table based on that model. So instead of having to go in and like make an SQL schema, you can work in Python land and just use your objects and pass those into it. So once we have the database created, we can then refer to this table in the database. So if we go back to that initial index page that we had, we notice every time we load that page, it loads one of these posts. So how do we do that? I'll sort of skip these first few lines here because they go into how we handle like a query for the dankest or the dustiest post. So we'll go down here for just getting a post. So we have posts, we're putting that equal to, we have this dank post object now in our database, which is our table of dank posts. We want to query it, so we have .query, and then we want to get just a random one. So we hit we do .order by, and then there's this function that SQL Alchemy provides where you can order the table randomly. It's just called func.random. You pass that into order by. It'll put the table in a random order for you. We then only want one post because that's how we decided to lay out our website. So we have limit 1, so we only get one post, and then we hit .all to return all posts that fit that query. So that query completes, whatever posts are fit that query that we sent to the SQL database is now equal to post. So then we go down, we have this return render template, and then we're passing post via this entries name to our template. So that's how we actually pull something from the database and then send it into our template to actually get sent out to the user. So you can see here we can use Python to sort of change which query we want to do. So I don't know if you're familiar with URLs, but if you look at the layout file and we go back to that link for getting the dankest meme, we have the URL, and then we have this question mark, which in URL terms is an argument to the URL. You'll see this used a lot for like JavaScript stuff, and if you go to like Google, you'll notice there'll be like 50, 100 arguments that get passed and stuff. This just sort of tells the web page what you're looking for. So here we're defining an argument called dank rank. We're putting it equal to dankest so that when the user clicks that, it sends that a GET request to our server with that argument. So when we go back to this, we can see, oh, we're doing, what's the query? It's equal to, we have this request object. What are the arguments? We want to get the argument called dank rank. And then we say, if that's equal to dankest, do this. Else if it's equal to dustiest, do this. And you can see that these queries to the database are very similar to the previous one, except instead of ordering by some random arbitrary thing, we're doing order by. In the case of the dankest, we want to do it in descending order. So we want to sort the table in descending order and then get the top one. we're still limiting it to 1 because we only want to return the first entry. In the other case, we're just ordering it, which defaults to an ascending ordering of the table, and then returning 1, and then going back down here to sending it as the post that gets rendered into the template. Any questions on that? Any questions on Python syntax in general, since I'm sort of breezing through stuff? Yes. What do I want to cover next? I guess since that was sort of a query from the database, I'll go into how to store things into the database. Yes, all this is on GitHub. So GWTech Collective has a GitHub page as an organization. It's just called Web Dev Workshop 2016. It's the repository. Okay, so to get content from the user, usually you use some sort of form. So if you go back to the website, we have the submit form. If you inspect element and look into it, you'll notice there's a form. It has a couple fields. This is all HTML stuff that you have to set up for the site. But we have this input. We have one that's of the type text. We give it a name called title. Those are important because later on when the post request gets sent, we want to look at what the name of each field is so that we can get the value for it. We have another input of the type file. We limit it to of type image. This is all stuff that's on W3 schools. You can look up what different things you can restrict it by. You can restrict it to like just video files, just image files, just text files. And then we have the submit button, which obviously sends the post request to this URL we specify. So you can see it says form action, action equals, and then it's going to be a URL. So we see it's /add. If we go back to our Python code, we see we have app.root/add. So when we send this data, it's getting sent to this function. So when we add the entry, we're going to ask if you're logged in or not. Flask provides this very easy to use sort of session variable that makes it very easy to set whether or not a user is logged in or not. You just toggle it between logged in and logged out. It's very convenient. And another if statement here. So we're asking if they're posting data and not just getting the form to post data, we're going to do some stuff. So we're getting a file name. So we're looking at the request. So anytime something gets sent via a post request or a get request, we can call this request item. In this case, we're looking for files. And then if you look at the HTML, we gave that specific item in the form the name image file. So we're pulling the value from image file, and then we do some other stuff here. If you look at, I don't know, if you forget the exact Google query, if you look at uploading files with SQLite or something, Flask provides some functions that makes it so you can do some very simple checks for making sure people aren't uploading malicious stuff or stuff that will very obviously break your website. So we say if there's a file and it's an allowed file, make sure it's also a secure file name. We call this function here file.save. So what are we doing? We're taking the file the user uploaded in that form. We're doing this os.path.join. This basically just takes two strings and puts them together so that they look like a file directory on your computer. And we're using the upload folder directory, which I defined earlier in the file, and the file name. So this is what actually saves the file the user uploaded to your computer or your server. Now note that this is not adding it to the database. This is physically uploading that file to a folder on your server. So if you look here, we have uploads, we have two things, we have that Drake photo, and then the stupid one with the pen on the lip. So now that we have the file on the server, we need some way to keep track of where that file went and what post it's associated with and what the title was. So we make a new post of the type dank post, which is what we define for our database, and we pass it the arguments that we use this request.form title. That's to get the title from the post request that was sent from the user. And then the second argument is just the file name that we already did all this stuff on to check to make sure it's secure and not like telling your database to drop files and stuff. Here's where we actually add that entry. So this is actually going to add the row to your database with a new entry for that post. And then an important thing with databases is generally you can always add a ton of stuff, and then you have to call a second function that commits all that stuff to the database. The actual commit is usually sort of resource heavy, so sometimes it's a good idea to maybe save the commit for once you have like 10 posts or something if you're dealing with like a high volume of traffic. In this case, we aren't, so we're just immediately committing that to the database. And then you can see we're doing, in this case, it's a little different. So in the past, anytime we had a return, we were rendering a template. In this case, we don't want to just render a template. We want to move the user back to the index page. We don't want to send them back to the submission page. We want to move them back to the front page, and it'll just show a random entry from that. So we do a redirect call, and then we get the URL for show posts, which is that function for that default index page, and that'll move the user's web browser from their submission back to the front page of the website. And you can sort of see here, the other thing I didn't really get into was it has this directory on the website has both the get and post methods. So you see here it has if request.method equals post. This means the user's posting data. So this is when we're dealing with getting a file and storing stuff to the database, we want to do the redirect. But if they're not posting, if you go to danktank.com/add, that's a get request. So instead of acting like you're submitting data, it's going to instead do this return render template, and it's going to send you the form for uploading files instead of acting like you're uploading a file. Okay, I guess the other thing I can sort of cover, if there aren't any questions pending on that, is how we do the upvoting and downvoting. We didn't get this to work as seamlessly as we wanted to last night, but it still works. But sort of what happens there is you'll notice in the show post template, we have those two buttons, Dank or Dusty, and then they each have an ID. So this is one thing you sort of need to keep track of if you're sort of doing back-end coding while doing CSS work. Is it's usually better to use classes for the CSS because sometimes you want to reserve the ID to uniquely refer to things on the page for your backend. So in this case, we just set that ID equal to the value of the entry in the database, since that's the primary key and tells us uniquely what post that button refers to. So then we do some other stuff. It's technically Ajax, but we're doing it through the jQuery sort of subset of JavaScript. So if we go to our JavaScript file that we have on this website, it's just called boats. I should probably get rid of that. We have this function defined here. I won't go too much into JavaScript, A, because I don't know much JavaScript. This is the most JavaScript I've written in like 6 months. But basically we're saying for every button on the page, if it gets clicked, we're going to call this function. If the button has the class, we have classes defined so that you can tell whether a button is the dank button or the dusty button. So if it has the class button dank, we're going to post a vote to the web server, and in that post, we're including two pieces of data. So this is very similar to a Python dictionary. If you get familiar with Python, dictionaries are very nice when you're working with stuff like posts and JSON files. But we're sending two pieces of data. We're sending this.attribute ID, which is sending the button's ID to the server, and then we're saying whether the vote's an upvote or a downvote. Of course, this isn't very secure. It's not very like, oh, you can only vote once. You can clearly like mash the button like 1,000 times, or just like script post requests to the server and just like make your mean the dankest very easily. But this was just sort of a very naive implementation of the upvote downvote system. Ideally, this stuff will sort of automatically load just the content section. Instead of reloading the whole page, it'll just drop in a new post. We didn't get too far into that. There's different ways you can do that with like socket.io, with like push and pull requests from the server. Maybe we'll do a later workshop on that if I feel like implementing it. But basically, this is how that upvote downvote works. So it calls this JavaScript that does a post request. That post gets sent specifically to, if we go down here, where is that defined? The post. Okay, so in that post request, it has this vote. That's the URL that we're posting to. So if we go back to our functions and that URL /vote, so approot/vote, we say, hey, we got this ID from the user. They're asking from a specific post, or they're voting on a specific post. So we look at our dank post table query. We get the query, and we get the row entry in that table with the ID that that button has. And then we say, okay, we have the ID. We got that row from the table. And now we say, well, if it's an upvote, increment the dank rank by 1. If it's a downvote, increment the dank rank by -1. If it's not either of those, don't do anything. And since we changed the value in our table, you have to commit it. And then because we don't want to sort of do anything based on that, like this is just sort of updating a value, we return nothing to the browser. So the browser won't do anything because it's not getting any new data to work with. So I guess that's pretty much the entire site. I don't know. That's sort of the functionality you can get with Flask in 100 lines of Python packed together in one night. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. If you want to if you haven't gotten it up and running, I can help you get Python running for this if you want. If you want to leave, you can leave. We'll be here for at least another 10 minutes. It's up to you.
I started hacking together some CSS. But one thing when you're actually, say, writing, whether it's the backend code or the HTML or CSS, you want to think about writing readable code and keeping track of things rather than just throwing stuff together. And so the way I set up the style sheet is kind of hierarchically going down. So I mean, you can see if you look through here some of the different things we define. So I start at kind of those top tags, so things that are going to apply to everything in the whole site. So stuff defining font size for the whole HTML document, stuff in the body, etc. And you can see how you can apply things to multiple tags just by putting commas between them. The other thing is when you're actually adding, say, like for the body, I have a bunch of different um, things I'm setting here. One thing that I have found useful and a lot of people suggest is ordering those alphabetically so that when you're reading through this code, you say, all right, if I want to just look for the font size on different things, it's easier when you're going through hundreds of lines of CSS find within there, all right, here's the value that I'm using to set that. But also just breaking things up. So I have my different link styles. So the colors on links, you can change how they look when you hover over them, things like that. So, I mean, I would look through here just to get an idea of the different things you can set up because obviously this site has kind of more of an actual look to it than the stuff we were doing just in JSBin. But there's not anything. And then, yeah, so like we were talking about before, at the bottom of the CSS, you'll see the different media adjustments. So this is what you were saying before about having at media. You can set for specific width of media. So um, basically, this one is standard for like phones. Um, so you can set, say, above, there's a specific link color that you want to change when everything is condensed down because the background might be different, so you need to have a different font color for it to stand out, or just the way the sidebar changes. So when I shrink the site down, what I do is actually put a top border on the sidebar. Let me show. Right, there's no border on top there, but when I shrink down, I give this line just to separate the content from the sidebar. So different things that give you the ability to add them in or change how they look um, when you change the width of your page. I don't know if you want to say anything more about how you kind of keep your code neat, but I think that's important. Any questions? Yeah. Um, so when you're on the phone version, it's just a picture. There's no ability to play it, or is it just that autoplay is disabled? Basically, what they probably have set up are two different divs. So you'll have your video div that is showing when you're, yeah. Basically, you'll have it. They're both probably there all the time, but when you switch within the media, you can say, all right, I want the. You can either say display none so that doesn't show, or visibility hidden so that it goes away. Right. So you'll hide one and then set the other one to show at that certain width. Right. But they're both always there. You're just defining at what point they become hidden or showing. Any other questions? All right, so let me end. Thank you to everyone who's watching. Adam, pretty much.